We won't wait. We won't run. We'll conjure up the courage we need to create solutions for our homeland, our Africa. With our courage, we will innovate for our time.
We will raise up a new generation of independent actors who, with us, will build a new tomorrow.
We won't wait. We won't run.
We'll do it ourselves. We are #DIY Africa.
Welcome to #DIY Africa, presented by the Civic Tech Innovation Forum and Jamfest.
Hi, everyone. Warm welcome to Jamfest, co-hosted along with the Civic Tech Innovation Forum. Thank you for joining us from all across the continent and the rest of the world for this year's festival under the #DIY Africa theme. My name is Becca Aronson, and I work as the Interim Executive Director of the News Product Alliance. Today, I will be facilitating this interactive discussion titled Product Thinking and Development for Newsrooms. This session is co-hosted by Jamlab and CTIN and in partnership with the South African Media Innovation Program. We hope that you leave this session with knowledge and a better understanding of the considerations you need to take into account for thinking about and building news products. So some housekeeping rules now that we've been properly welcomed. If you can, please share and tweet today's conversation on social media using the hashtag Jamfest Africa 2021 and #DIY Africa. I personally, and I know everyone at Jamfest would really love this discussion to be interactive. So please use the Q&A function for any questions directed to me or for comments and queries. You can use either the chat function in Zoom or Wova, and I'll be reading those things. We'll also allow you to unmute at times if you want to jump into the conversation. So just as you're aware, this session is being recorded and it will be publicly available on our various digital platforms in different formats. All right, I'm going to share my slides now. Oop. All right, can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. All right, so like I said, I'm Becca Aronson. I'm currently the Interim Executive Director of the
Can you just make your slides full screen?
What?
Make it full screen.
Oh, okay, hold on.
It's in your computer screen. Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, great. So I'm Becca Aronson. I lead the News Product Alliance, which is a global community of support and practice for news product professionals. I'll tell you a little bit more about the MPA in a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about my career story. I was formerly the Director of Product at Kpis, a nonprofit that does local education reporting in the United States, and also the first ever product manager at the Texas Tribune, another nonprofit organization that does statewide politics and policy coverage in Texas. So at both those organizations, I led website redesigns, I rebuilt their membership programs, worked on newsletter products, and also built award-winning visual presentations for investigative reporting. But like many of you, I started my career as a reporter. I wanted to create interactive stories so readers could connect more deeply with my reporting. And I learned how to code and build data visualizations and multimedia presentations. But at some point, I started thinking, I don't know if this is working. I don't know if people are actually engaging more deeply with my reporting just because I'm putting all of this effort into the presentation. And so I also started asking our editors and the other people I was working with, the designers, the developers, like, you know, are our processes for putting together these packages efficient? Are we utilizing our resources effectively? And as I sought out tools for understanding our audience needs and experience and improving how we work together within the newsroom, I became a product thinker. To confront the challenges facing news organizations all across the world today, journalists are being forced to ask existential questions that product managers and software companies typically ask. What is the problem we're solving? Whose needs do we serve? And how do we connect the two? Product thinkers, those who have the ability to align editorial, audience, technology, and business goals, have become the missing link in creating sustainable journalism. So I'd love to throw it out to everyone who's joining us today and get your perspective on what do you think product management is, or what do you think product thinking is? So feel free to use the chat and let me know what your ideas are. So how many of you have been in an editorial meeting when someone says, we should do a podcast about this, or why don't we start a newsletter? I think a product thinker is often someone who asks, why? How will this benefit? Looks like we have one person raising their hand to speak. Would you like to unmute, Samaya?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great, wonderful. Yes, I have been on so many of those meetings where it's not only about the content, but it's also about the medium and the target that you want to reach out to. So just to answer your question, probably product thinking is more about thinking about the goal of publishing a
Oh, it looks like you cut out. We can't hear your audio anymore. Oh, I feel like you were right there before you cut off, Samaya. But yes, it is about kind of thinking about the goal of what you're building, not just how you're going to build it or why you personally want to build it, but getting to that goal. What is the value that you're offering to your audience, and how does it contribute to your business or your journalism mission? We have another person in the chat who's saying editorial and the finance team coming together to grow and make money from editorial. That is sometimes the way it is. But I like to think of product thinking more about kind of finding a balance, right? As journalism institutions, we always put our ethics front and center. It's really about how are we serving our communities and delivering information in an ethical way so that they can make the best decisions for their own lives. And in order to continue doing that, we have to make money, and we have to be able to support the journalism and create this sustainable business function, right? So it is coming together and figuring out how do we align these two goals so that we're delivering the best value for our audience while also creating a sustainable enterprise so that we can keep doing this work, continue to create this value. Oh, it looks like Smaya's back. Do you want to finish saying what you were saying?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you heard everything. I wasn't aware. I was disconnected. So yes, it's exactly the same thing that you were just mentioning. It's thinking about the news as a product and how people, like the audiences in general, consume this product. So it is about creating this balance. And I was just saying that it's very important to start thinking in terms of news and product. And this is a trend that's actually starting in different parts of the world, and I think this has a great future to keep in mind and to think about when producing content. So thank you very much, Becca.
Great comment. All right, looks like we have someone else who's raised their hand and wants to jump in. I can't see your name though.
It's Naima.
Hey, Naima.
I think it's me.
Yes.
So I think for me, because the organization that I work for isn't a sort of like media operational for the AWJP, the African Women Journalism Project, it is more a support for journalists and trying to work in terms of allowing women journalists to get the skills they need to get up in the newsroom and also report on underreported stories. So earlier this year, I was taking a refresher course about product management, and it actually made us question what was our product, and it was a very difficult sort of scenario, because I thought our customer would be the journalist, except the customer is the person who's paying for it. So this would be funders, non-governmental organizations, and then the journalists were the users. I think for to have lasting impact, that process is our product. So that was something that was a bit difficult to come to terms with in terms of what exactly is our product as an organization.
Yeah, that is a great insight. I've heard some people describe a product as the exchange of value in some form, like a customer is buying something and in return they receive some sort of value from your business.
Yeah.
And for newsrooms, I think they have sometimes a similar issue that you're describing of, maybe they're users in the newsroom. They're building internal tools for making newsletters or publishing stories. And the user is actually the reporter in the newsroom. And then the customer is the audience that's consuming that story. So I think that distinction that you've pointed out about sometimes this exchange of value, you have two different stakeholders that you're trying to kind of
to balance it out.
Great. Well, let's keep moving on. So as we've kind of said, product thinkers are those people who are connecting the dots between the editorial, audience, business, and technology strategy. A product creates an exchange of value for your audience and your organization. And product thinking as a discipline is putting that product and its ability to succeed with your audience at the center of how your organization works. So to do that, you have to understand your audience and you have to understand your editorial mission, your business, and your technology resources and needs. So the basic idea is whatever you're creating, whether it's a service, a piece of content, a platform, or a delivery mechanism like a newsletter or podcast, all of these things are products. And as such, you need to consider how the audience or user will engage with it and how the product will serve your business goals and what technology or resources you need to make it. That is a lot, right? That's a lot of work. It can be very, very challenging. So product managers have a handful of tools and frameworks that can facilitate strategic decision-making and help you throughout the product development cycle to work in cross-functional teams, bring in diverse perspectives, and figure out kind of, what user research do we need? What technology decisions do we need to consider? What are our ethical considerations? What is our editorial? Over the past decade or more, we've seen many news organizations shift from being content-centric to being more audience-centric, from thinking about, how do we invest in our capacity to interact and understand our audience so we are delivering what they need. But audience teams now, they don't just tweet out headlines, right? They're interacting with the community and they're measuring audience engagement to help refine the editorial content strategy. And many are focused on doing this. Many who are focused on doing this work run into obstacles when they try and actually drive that change in their organization. And they feel like they need, to connect the audience and editorial strategy to what the business's overall sustainability and revenue goals are. So how many of you feel like there isn't enough collaboration or communication sometimes between the different departments in your organization? The editorial team and the revenue team are not on the same page, or even your social team and your engineering team are not on the same page. It feels like one part of the organization is maybe working against or at odds another part, not intentionally, but just because there isn't enough communication about, what is happening. So product management is a function within an organization to guide product development and strategy and create alignment and create better communication between the different teams. So, the discipline of product management emerged originally in technology companies to put the audience or the customer at the center of decision-making. Marketing teams were finding that they were hearing feedback from customers about what wasn't working, and that information wasn't ever going to the engineering team or the people who are making business decisions. And therefore, the products continued to suffer and customers continued to be unhappy. And so they created this role in which they could, facilitate that communication. Newsrooms have an even more difficult task because they have to connect what their audience needs to the editorial mission and develop a sustainable business strategy, usually with very, very limited resources. Plus, we have to do this while maintaining our ethical standards. So traditionally, there's been a hard wall between newsrooms and revenue and editorial departments for good reason. We want to protect our editorial integrity. And product thinkers are introducing a bridge so that these teams can align their interests in some ways. But they still have to maintain those ethical lines, and it can be very challenging, and you can run into a lot of kind of resistance, and particularly to some kinds of like cultural changes that are happening in your organization. So that brings me to the News Product Alliance, where I work. We are a global community of support and practice for news product thinkers. Our mission is to elevate the discipline of news product management and expand the diversity of product thinkers in decision-making roles. And what we do essentially is we bring people together to share knowledge and provide support for one another through, peer-to-peer coaching and mentorship and networking and things like that. So we run a global Slack community, which you are welcome to join at newsproduct.org/Slack, where you can meet like-minded people and talk about the challenges you might be facing in your news organization, and join us for various events. We do things like resume reviews, where we compare how we're telling our career stories. We do demo days where people share how they use tools like Airtable to facilitate the pitch process within their newsroom or manage their editorial calendar. And we also do other kinds of lightning talks and things like that. Yesterday, we had an event where academics came together and shared their syllabi. The syllabuses for how they actually teach product to graduate and undergraduate students in journalism programs. So if you feel like this resonates with you, I highly welcome you to join our community space. So you do not need a product title or a product team to apply product thinking in your newsroom. Our initial community survey found that out of the 300 initial people that we surveyed, more than 70% don't have product titles. And more than half of them described their job as a product or bridge role. So other people in this group include like data scientists, news executives, journalists, technologists. And a lot of people think of, product managers as tech people, but they don't necessarily have to be on the engineering team. Oftentimes they are digital editors, newsletter editors. They work on social media teams, places like that. So, a newsletter editor is also a product thinker because they're thinking about the content, testing new forms of engagement with the audience, and they're working with engineers to improve the features of the newsletter and coordinating with sales and revenue teams about ad placements. They're in this bridge role, right, where they're talking to people all across the organization about how to make the best newsletter possible. So you don't have to have a product title to be a product thinker. And it looks like we have a question. Great question. Someone has asked, I find that more freelancers are having to become product managers to serve their niche audiences. Is there a freelancer version of this? There are more and more, I think, consulting jobs related to product strategy for news organizations, which is a kind of freelancer version of it. I've been asked, for example, I know many people who have been asked to help a newsroom kind of sort through a strategy of some kind. So yes, there's definitely some room for some freelancing in this area. Great. So if this is all new to you, or maybe you've heard a little bit about product before, but you're still kind of trying to get your head around it, I think it's important to note that a lot of journalism skills translate to product skills. My background was a reporter and I became a product manager. So while some of these things are a little bit different, you need to fine tune them for the different kind of work. A lot of it is taking that journalistic curiosity and turning it inward in your organization to figure out how you can solve problems within your organization, not just externally in the community, right? So interviewing and reporting can help you learn how to conduct audience research and find out more about what your audience needs. Writing a really strong net graph and being able to kind of consolidate things in a very tight and clear way can also help you write clear goals and clarify the value that you're delivering to your audience. Pitching a story, pitching a product, knowing how to make your case and sell your point, knowing how to kind of grade the data or the strategy around what your product should be and why. And then managing an editorial calendar, managing a product roadmap. We all have to have deadlines, right? The time scale is very different. Managing a product roadmap is often on a much longer time scale than managing an editorial calendar. But at the same time, you're still kind of trying to balance all of these needs and think about the long-term project aspect of it. And owning a beat can often be very similar to maintaining and iterating a product. You have ownership of it and you kind of know all the key components, but you need to develop them over time. So I want to throw this back out there to all of you again and ask, what does product culture look like in news organizations? If you are centered around kind of a shared mission to create products that deliver value for your audience and serve your organization's goals, what would that look like in terms of how the organization works together? Feel free to jump into the chat or raise your hand if you would like to unmute and share. So Simpra says a lot of collaboration and experimenting. Yes, lots of collaboration, lots of experimenting, kind of testing out ideas. Samaya, do you want to jump in?
Yes, of course. So I'm based in the Middle East, and product culture for us is still something very new. And I think it's a field that, like the culture is not still very much understood. People are trying to put the puzzle together and understand what product is. But until now, I feel there is not much appreciation of this concept in particular. So maybe I can turn this into a question. How can we develop that culture, and how can we make it more understood in an environment where nobody have heard of this before? Thanks, Becca.
Yeah. I'd love for those of you who feel like you do have a little bit of a product culture to jump into the chat and tell us like how it got started, right? I would say the thing that you can do to start fostering a product culture is, to Simpra's point, collaboration, finding ways to bring people together and start to understand the work that each person brings to the table. So for me, the most important part is collaboration among and across teams. So you have to have this clear communication. You can use tools like a roadmap and things like that to create more communication into what you're building. But you also need to develop one-on-one relationships with different department heads and different individual contributors on these teams so you understand the role and the value they can bring. And then you need to form, some people call them pods, some people call them squads, some people just call them cross-functional teams, where you bring people together from different parts of the organization to work on something together and share their expertise and align around a common goal and understanding of what they're working towards. It could be that you just start off with some simple design thinking, brainstorming sessions and get people kind of curious. And it could be that you do some training like lunch and learns, where you offer open sessions for people to learn about the work that others are doing across the organization. But when you get to a point where the teams are eager to work together, that's when you know that you have something good going for product culture. Another thing that you'll find a lot of is audience-focused goal setting, putting the audience first. Your team and your journalists are asking questions like, how are we serving our audience? How do we think our reader or our listener would experience this? I know that I've personally been in many situations where an editor or someone has come in and said, I want to do this thing. That's why this guy is here being like, I want a castle. They think because it's something they've done before that it will be successful, or because it's an idea that they had that, they really want to pursue it. But breaking that down and saying, okay, what about this idea would resonate with our audience? Who is it going to serve? How are we going to deliver it? And kind of assessing it for what it is. You might still pursue that idea. It might ultimately be a good idea that connects with the audience, but making sure you're not just doing things for the sake of doing them, but you're doing them for the sake of your audience. Again, clear and consistent communication. So teams that know how to make decisions together and then prioritize tasks accordingly. So making decisions together can be very challenging at times. People have different responsibilities and goals for themselves and for the organization. And so figuring out how do you assign roles so that you can make decisions effectively, and also how are you prioritizing things so that kind of you're all on the same page about what's the most important. So setting clear expectations. about how you're going to keep other teams up to date, how you're going to work together, and how progress is going to be made. And lastly, this point about experimentation, right? Using data and iterative processes to guide your development. So I like the term data guided because it's about using data and information to guide decision-making rather than using data and information to determine decision-making. So whenever we do audience research, whenever we collect analytics on our audience behavior, there's always going to be something missing, right? Like we're never going to have a complete picture. And so it's knowing when you have enough information to make a decision and when you have enough information to kind of understand, like, this is something that we should test. We have a strong enough hypothesis that we should now test this because our data is pointing to it. And then using iteration, small tests or larger ones to assess whether your strategy is working and then making adjustments. So a lot of times people use this concept of design do, which is like you design something, you do it, you assess it, and then you kind of take that knowledge back and you design again, this iteration, design do. Software teams often work on 2-week cycles called sprints that allows them to kind of say, okay, we're going to get this much of work done in 2 weeks, and then we're going to assess it, and then we're going to come back and assess it again. And you kind of keep going on this cycle. I'm going to take a moment to read a comment. Another key thing to collaboration is also around common language. I think this is a great point, Sarah. Establishing definitions with everyone as what different terms means that they're on the same page. We found that sometimes it feels we're at cross purposes, but the issue was using language that wasn't well understood across the team. I 100% agree with this point. I think a lot of times people use different language when they come from specifically like, a technology or a marketing background or a business background. You learn certain terms. And in the newsroom, we know newsrooms and journalists have their own language for how they talk about things. And oftentimes you are saying the same thing, but you just don't understand each other's terms, or the foreignness of the language that you're using can make it seem like, you're not on the same page. So I love this point, Sarah. It is about kind of learning each other's language as well. So product thinkers, just to rehash, are deeply committed to understanding audience needs, clarifying the desired business outcomes, building products that deliver value to audiences and serve the organization's goals, and collaborating and clearly communicating across teams and functions. So if these things resonate with you, you are likely a product thinker. And here's what we just talked about with what product culture looks like in news organizations. Does anyone have anything they would like to add? All right. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm going to pronounce your name correctly. Nokazola agrees with the last point. Even in this presentation, the only reason I can understand some of the words used is because I've taken online courses in UX and design, for example. Yes, great point. There's a lot of stuff in here that is very product languagey. And so if you find one thing that I did early on when I was reading a lot about product management is how everyone uses the term user in software companies. I talk about the user. And I found when I used that term in my newsroom, it just was very off-putting to people. They were like, no, we're not here for a user. We're here for our community. We're here for our audience. And those words resonated a lot more than using the word user. And so you might just, as you're introducing concepts like this in your newsroom, think about the language that you're using and if it's accessible to people. So one reason why you might, or a few reasons why you might try and incorporate more product culture into your news organization is because it can help improve alignment, decision-making, and your execution. So alignment, getting everyone on the same page. Audience research is really great for this. When I was at the Texas Tribune, we used to do things called guerrilla happy hours or guerrilla testing happy hours, where we would take whatever we were working on to a bar, and we bring reporters who are working on that project with us, designers and developers, and we'd ask them to go talk to random people, show them the project we were working on, and get their feedback on it. And by involving everyone in this process, we all started to get on the same page in terms of what the audience research was telling us, and we could talk about it, and we could say okay, let's change this or that because this is what we heard from people, right? And we're involving everyone on the team, not just the designers. So this is going to help create alignment, right? You're getting on the same page. Also working together, making sure you have cross-functional teams involved in the goal setting process itself, and you're taking in different people's perspectives when you're setting goals. Great for creating alignment. Decision-making. Like I said, this is really hard. So there are tools you can use to prioritize. You can also think about how are you managing your stakeholders, bringing people into this process, and managing your resources effectively. So product culture can help improve how you make those decisions together. And finally, it can also help improve how you actually execute things. If you're communicating well, if you're collaborating, if you have a strong roadmap and you are working together, the execution of the product itself can be better, right? Because you're taking in user feedback and other stakeholder feedback and improving the product as you go. So, like I said, this is very hard. So I'd love to hear from all of you, what are some of the challenges that you think have limited your team's ability to do cross-team collaboration? Okay, while I wait for you guys to respond, we did get another question. What is the best practice to testing and iteration? Are you doing it on the live product, or have you created a separate platform where you test it out on a group of users? This is a both and type situation, right? There are many ways to do testing and iteration. If you are in the very, very early stages of product development, it's good, like some people even do paper prototypes where before they even build a digital product, they draw it out on paper, they create wireframes and mockups, and they put those in front of users or potential audience members to get their feedback and see if it's working, right? And you can test it out on that kind of group of users. But once you have something that's already built, say you have a website or newsletter that you want to change or iterate on, there are plenty of ways that you can do small tests. You could do an A/B test, where you try one version for a group of people for a certain amount of time and one version for another, and then see which one is more effective. Or you can make a small change and see, over a 3-week period, has this made any significant difference on like the data measures that we're tracking, like, time on page or click-through rates on certain things like that. So I would say no matter what stage of development you're in, you should always be kind of testing and iterating on your product. And there are so many ways to do this, from collecting data and making changes to the product to just putting it in front of users and asking for their feedback. So some of the challenges that I'm hearing from you, the old guard are a hindrance. Senior members of the team don't want to change or implement something that they don't understand. It's difficult to get people from different teams to get aligned and agree in certain ways. Yes, I would agree. Sometimes that can be very challenging. When I worked in one of the biggest newsrooms in South Africa, even though I was part of a digital team, the editors came from a print framework and struggled to let go of old ways of thinking. Even as a writer, print content was taken much more seriously, even during the editing process, more than digital content. Yes, I think a lot of people would agree with that experience and say they've had similar ones as well. So, I think the people management of it, that cultural change that you're working towards, can be incredibly challenging. And some of it is about building one-on-one relationships with people, and figuring out kind of what their needs are and how you can meet their needs while also getting them to see a little bit more of your perspective. Some of it is figuring out who like the power holders are in the organization and just trying to create influence that way, maybe moving around some of the people that are more resistant to change. But as you might know, like the power holders are not necessarily the people who on the management hierarchy have the most power. Sometimes power holders are people who just have a lot of influence in the organization. They're highly respected, or people look up to them, so thinking about how you can build relationships with those people and get them to understand where you're coming from. Cool. So let's talk about some of the tools that might help you in this process, right? That might help you either in the product development process itself, or to kind of get people to understand kind of why this is important or why this can help the organization as a whole, right? So I'm going to go over a few groups. A lot of these things I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but it's all very Googleable. You can find resources on all of these tools and stuff online beyond my presentation. So audience research. There are lots of ways to conduct audience research. Some of them are qualitative, meaning you're going to get information that is not necessarily like, well, there's qualitative and quantitative information, right? So qualitative information is more subjective. It's like things about how a user behaves and feels that aren't necessarily a science, but kind of understanding and talking to lots of different people can give you a general sense of the themes and the subjective experience that your audience is having. And then qualitative data, which is hard metrics. So these might be coming from, your website or your newsletter. You're getting data analytics on page views or open rates and things like that. These are qualitative. Surveys are a good tool for collecting both quantitative and qualitative information from your audience, because you can ask them open-ended questions to get their perspective on things. And then you can also ask them multi-choice questions or, ranked choice questions is more or less, do you agree with this statement? That kind of thing. They give you more quantitative information. So once you have a general understanding of your audience, once you're trying to collect this on a routine basis, you can apply it in lots of different ways. So personas are a way of capturing themes about your user experience and putting together a kind of made up person who represents lots of different aspects of what you've gathered in your user experience, so that in the design process, you can, think about that persona and how they would interact with your product and what it would serve for them, what needs you were meeting for that particular persona. Empathy mapping is a way of kind of tracking, how the user experience is connected to the value that you're delivering. And it's a way of kind of building on these personas. And then jobs to be done, which we'll go over in just a second and a little bit more depth. But jobs to be done is about kind of capturing the need of your audience in a particular context and how you're actually going to be serving this. It looks like we have a question from Naima. For news orgs here, do you run iterations on new features on MVPs or on completed products? So if anyone has feedback on that, do you run on your current things? Do you do iterations on new features on your MVPs or just on your completed projects? Do you do testing in the early phases or just when things are done? Feel free to jump into the chat and answer her question. So I'd love for us to do a little bit of a jobs to be done exercise together. So feel free to jump in here and also use the chat. So like I said, jobs to be done are about kind of thinking about your users' situation and what is a job that they need to have accomplished that you can actually meet or complete this need for them. So this framework is an easy way of structuring these statements. So when the audience is in a particular situation, I want to complete certain task or do this thing so that I can have this expected outcome. So an example of this might be when I'm getting ready for work, I want to hear the top headlines of the day so that I'm aware, so that I can be aware of any breaking news that might affect my day. Oh, and great question. What is NVP? It is a minimal viable product. This is, again, one of those like very tech developer terms, but it's basically what is the most simple version of your product that you can deliver that will have the value, the minimum viable product. So would anyone like to throw out kind of a job to be done that they see for their users or in their newsroom for the things that they're building? Nope. Okay, we'll just keep going. So being more in line, so jobs to be done can come in lots of different formats. And I think the BBC World Service in 2017, they did a lot of audience research to determine kind of why were people reading their news articles? What were the different kind of motivations to go back to the jobs to be done? Like what were these I want to statements that they were finding users had when they were looking at the BBC's content and stories. And this research was done by Dmitry Shishkin. So he found that there were kind of these 6 key categories for why users were reading different types of news stories. You know, was this story keeping me on trend or inspiring me? Did it amuse me? Did it educate me? Did it give me perspective on a topic, or was it functional? Did it just update me on some sort of breaking news? So you can start to categorize the different kinds of content that you're using and figure out what is the outcome that this content is delivering for the audience. What needs is it serving for them? So I think this is kind of, helpful in thinking about how to make your editorial content more aligned with your product strategy. So are you focusing a lot? Does your audience want a bunch of stories that, are keeping them updated on the news and breaking news of the day? If so, maybe you invest more in news stories, summaries, write-ups, live blogs, news videos, things like that. But maybe they come to you to be amused. And so you should focus more on kind of cultural content, videos, picture galleries, or surprising, feature stories. You might also think about what is the kind of, education that they need. Like if they want to be educated, like how to do certain things. Maybe you do more how-to videos or explanatory animations, things like that. So getting an understanding of kind of what particular things your audience comes to your news organization for can help you refine your content and your editorial strategy. Goal setting frameworks. So these are mostly taken from, management and business background things. So you might have heard of these things before, but SMARTY goals, creating goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. So making sure that your goals are things that, you don't just want to say, hey, I would like to lose weight. You would say, I want to lose 5 pounds in the next 3 months by maintaining my exercise routine. That's more of a SMARTY style goal, because you're being more specific about the time frame and like the specific numbers that you want to achieve. Objectives and key results. These are kind of another way of kind of formatting your SMARTY goals. So you might have a high level objective, say, I want to run a marathon. And then your key results are the benchmarks that you need to hit along the way to know that you're on your way to hitting that key objective. So it might be like maintaining an exercise routine, eating certain healthy foods, blah, blah, blah. But you include the data and the amount of time that you would take in making sure that this is achievable and relevant to the higher level objective. On a news team or on a cross-functional team, I found that objectives and key results can be really helpful in aligning the many ways that an objective can be successful, because you can use the key results to kind of signify, okay, this must be true for the editorial team, or this must be true for the social and audience engagement level. Well, this must be true for how much revenue we're making, right? So like we are not creating a successful newsletter, which is our high level objective, unless we are meeting the needs of our audience in this way with some specific measurable key result, and we're not creating enough revenue to support the product in this way. So I think that's a nice way of kind of bringing together many different cross-functional goals. You also might have things that help you understand your goals, like key performance metrics or KPIs. I throw this in here because it's one of those terms people often hear but don't know. And a key performance metric is usually just any baseline data point that your team uses to measure like its relative health. So it could be, your average page views, average time on page, things like that can be key performance metrics that basically just let you know what is the general balance of how something is performing. And a P&L, which I put this on here again because it was a term I heard people use many times before I understood what it meant, but a profit and loss statement. And this is kind of a budgeting type document where you look at kind of the resources going in to produce something, and then the revenue or the profits coming out of it, and keeping that balanced and making sure that what you're putting into something is, comparable to what you're getting out of it. So a lot of times what you'll find is that you need to bring people together to ideate and collaborate. So curating diverse participation is really important for these things, making sure you have people along kind of with the Maynard Institute, which is a group in the US calls fault lines. These are things like race, gender, class, sexual orientation, geography, these kind of different things that make up a person's identity. But also career level and area of expertise, having junior and senior members of the team together, and also having, designers, developers, editors, salespeople, bringing in these diverse perspectives so you can get kind of a range of ideas and expertise. And then also making sure you're rooting your ideation when you start actually thinking about what you're going to build, what you're going to do, you're rooting it in your audience research. So it's based on a real audience need. So if you haven't heard of design thinking before, Google does things like design thinking sprints, like a 5-day sprint that's all about ideating a product solution and prototyping it and testing it. But design thinking can also be used throughout the entire design and development process. And there are lots of different ways people do brainstorming tools. One of these is jobs to be done, which we already kind of talked about. And another one is how might we? And this is where you essentially put a statement up on the board and say, how might we blank, whatever problem it is that you want to solve. And then you allow your team to do maybe some exercises where they draw out solutions to how we might solve this problem, or they put all their ideas on Post-its. And then you come together and you sort these things through and you see themes, and then you vote on kind of which ones are most relevant or most interesting. And you start to sort them and talk about how you can solve this problem together. So there are lots of ways to kind of bring people together to ideate and think about how they can collaborate. But once you have a lot of ideas, you will need to prioritize. I've found that this is often one of the most difficult conversations to have. When I was at the Texas Tribune, we spent a year on strategic planning for the next 5 years or 10 years. We were putting together kind of a comprehensive look at what the future of the organization was going to be. And there are all these different things that people wanted to do, right? They wanted to rebuild the CMS. They wanted to build a customer relations management service so that we could better personalize the website for members and people who were subscribed to us. They wanted to launch a new kind of membership style program, and they wanted to kind of diversify our editorial offering, all these different kinds of things, right? So we put a giant urgent versus important matrix on the wall, and we wrote out all of our ideas on Post-its, and I had kind of the senior staff and other people come and organize where on this matrix they would put all of these different ideas that we talked about doing, right? So you could start to see where there was alignment, and you could have people have discussions of like, is this thing slightly more important than this other thing? Is it slightly more urgent? And kind of find those areas of disagreement, but then come to a general consensus on how we were positioning these things in our minds about what was most important, what was most urgent. So we could have conversations about what would we pursue first, what would be longer term, things like that. Another way that you can do this matrix is ease versus impact. Ease being how hard or difficult is this task to accomplish, and impact being what difference will it make? Is it important for us to actually accomplish? Will it have a big impact on our audience or on our business? So if something is going to be incredibly difficult to do and the impact is very low, it won't really have that much significant effect on your audience, maybe it's not worth doing, right? So there are ways of kind of moving things around. So I'd love for us to kind of do this exercise together, if you guys are willing. So feel free to jump in the chat or unmute. And let's talk about kind of, so this example here is on the left, you'll see a handful of issues that are all around creating and launching a membership program. So this comes from a real newsroom example. So the things are, writing the onboarding emails and creating your marketing messaging for the membership program. Creating surveys that pop up so that people can get reader feedback on how to improve the membership program or improve their content so they can have a better membership offering. Setting up the data analytics processes, like their dashboards, they can measure how effective their onboarding is and if they're getting the number of members that they want. Creating a non-member newsletter. Someone else in the newsroom really wants to create another newsletter. How important is that to do right now? Fixing minor UX issues across the website that, create a worse experience and might hinder people from becoming members, but they aren't necessarily, blocking them. Creating a frictionless 3-step registration process, actually making the process for becoming a member as frictionless as possible. And creating a discussion space for members so that once you become a member, you have some value. So I'd love to hear from you guys where you would put these things. Great. So we have one person saying the 3-step registration process is very important. Is it urgent? I would say it's probably also urgent. Here. Let's go ahead and put this in our urgent and important, right? And someone asked, what are we doing again? Yes, we're launching a membership program. So the membership program is so that people can pay money, become members, and support the news organization. So here's another one, adding survey pop-ups, setting up data analysis and frictionless registration, all would be put in urgent and important. All right, I'm going to challenge one of these, but for now, let's put them all over in the urgent and important. Oops. And the frictionless registration, did I get that one? Yeah, okay. So what about these minor UX issues across the website? Where would you guys put this? Great, someone says creating the non-member newsletter is important but not urgent. Yes, let's do that. Important but not urgent, the minor issues. Okay. All right, we only have 2 more. So writing onboarding emails and marketing messaging. So if someone signs up to become a member, do they need to receive an email kind of informing them about what the membership has given them and things like that? And how do you start marketing this? I would say this is a fairly urgent and important thing, right? Because you can't really have the membership program without this. And not important, not urgent, the discussion space. Okay. All right. So let's look at this together, right? You can see that it's kind of unbalanced right now, right? We have a lot of things in our urgent and important category, a couple that are important but not urgent, which is good, right? But the balance of our matrix is off. So we need to kind of look at this urgent and important category and say, okay, are some of these things actually less urgent than others, right? So creating this registration process and doing our onboarding emails, to me, I think are the most urgent thing, important, because you can't have a membership program without these at all. Important but not urgent might be these survey pop-ups, right? Because this might be something that you want to do after you launch the membership program, once it's in effect, so that you can start to collect feedback and see why maybe resistors or people who are slower to adopt membership aren't doing it, or get feedback after people have signed up to become members on, is it still delivering the value? Are they going to renew? Things like that, right? So it's important, but it's not necessarily urgent in the same way that those other things are urgent, because they have to be done in order to launch the membership program. And that one doesn't have to be done in order to launch, right? So you start to kind of create this balance and you have this discussion with your team. Great. So I'm going to move on, but I think this was a great, thank you guys for being so interactive and helping me with this. All right. And so one thing also that you might do if you're using this tool in your newsroom is like you have this discussion with, what's urgent, what's important, you move things around with your team. And then you do the exact same thing, but you put it on the ease versus impact matrix. And you'll notice that some things start to move around. And that can make it a little bit easier to figure out like really what the most important priorities are, because there'll be things that are, going to have a lot of impact and they're urgent and important, right? And they might be more or less difficult to achieve on the ease aspect of it. But if you have a lot of things that are difficult to do, you can prioritize which ones are most urgent and important, right? So you can kind of use these things to find that balance when it's often, a really hard conversation to have because it seems like there's no structure to how you're making these decisions. And I even asked if we'll have access to the presentation afterwards. Yes, everyone will have access to it. So this is really, really important. Prioritization only works if you're able to say no to things that aren't connected to your team's goals. So remember going back to your SMARTY goals and creating alignment on your team. If you have very clear goals, it's easy to create priorities that align up to those goals and create general agreement across the team on, does this contribute to what we all want to accomplish? Our editorial mission. Is this all feeding up into our editorial mission and creating a more sustainable news organization? And however you've defined that in your goals. But if you can't say no to things that aren't relevant, that aren't contributing to your team's goals, you're going to be like, zigzagging across in all these different directions, and you're not going to have this alignment, and you're going to waste a lot of time and waste a lot of resources. So one inspiration that I found at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel is they created a stop doing list, and they would come back to this like every month or every few months. But it was a list of things that they were like, let's stop doing this. Let's stop publishing this newsletter that has lower and lower engagement and people aren't really reading it, or let's stop, covering these certain crime stories that are not that important to our audience and, continue to perpetuate certain stereotypes about this community that we're trying to rebuild our relationship with and create more coverage that is like of interest of them, right, to them, right? So like, what are things that we can stop doing that will free up resources for things that we should be doing more of? And having these conversations on a regular basis. So you might find once you start having more collaboration and more communication, everyone suddenly has an opinion, and that's great. You want those opinions. You want to hear what people have to say, but you also have to kind of determine who has the authority to make certain decisions and what kind of input is necessary from each person on the team. So you want to give everyone the autonomy to contribute in their way where they can offer the most expertise and their opinions on things. But you also want to make sure that they're clear on who the ultimate decision makers are and who is responsible for moving things forward, right? So these kind of frameworks on roles can be really helpful for that. So Mocha, Racy, and Daisy are all very similar. They essentially assign different roles on the team. So for Mocha, you have a manager, the person who is kind of managing the project overall. Then you might have a product owner. The owner is the person who is responsible for moving things forward. So the manager often oversees the owner. They might not necessarily on the hierarchy of the organization, but in terms of the context, the manager is responsible for the project overall, but the owner is the person who is moving things forward. And so they might, be sharing information with the manager. Consulted are people who are consulted for their opinion or their expertise. They're not necessarily contributing to the project, but you need their perspectives. These could be stakeholders like someone on the sales team or someone, on the editorial team, depending on what the project is, that you need their opinion on things, but they're not necessarily going to be making any of the decisions for the project. And then helpers, people who are helping the owner to move things forward by doing some task on the project. And finally, you have an approver. This is one person who is going to make the final call on, is this ready to go? Or will handle any kind of internal disagreement on, different directions. The approver is the one who will make the final call. So RACI is very similar. You have someone who is responsible for the project. You have someone who is accountable. This is the same thing as the approver role, the person who makes the final decision. You have supporters who might help in some capacity to get the project done, people who are consulted. And then it has another category of people who are informed, people who need to be kept in the loop about what's happening with this project, but they don't necessarily need to be consulted or have their opinion to weigh in on it. They just need to know what's happening with it. So you can use these different kind of frameworks to clarify roles. Another tool that you might find useful is called a constituency map. So this is where you kind of create categories on a table for people who are shaping and owning a decision, people who you need their support of, and who's delivering the actual product. And so you can kind of move people around this and see where they stand. So the next tool you might find useful is creating a shared roadmap. A roadmap visually communicates the tasks, the deadlines, and the deliverables necessary to execute on your vision. So things like a Gantt chart, a Kanban board, or to-do list are all different kinds of roadmaps. I think the key to a roadmap really is making sure that someone is updating it and keeping it up to date, because things change very quickly, right? Things change, especially in newsrooms, very quickly. So you need to have something that shows kind of the most up-to-date version of what's happening. So you might be wondering kind of what is a Gantt chart? So a Gantt chart is essentially a table that shows the different timelines for either a set of work or a project and how these overlap. So it can be really useful for kind of showing kind of when a project is winding up and when it's winding down, and how that work will overlap with other things you see further down the timeline. So you can get a longer scope vision of a project. A Kanban board is most useful for kind of looking at like where things stand on a shorter timeline or when something is like a little bit more flexible. So what it essentially does is creates different vertical fields for where projects are in their kind of like process. So you might have a general idea category of like, ideas that you have not discussed as a team yet. And then you might have things that, you need to do, the to-do category. Then you have in progress, being reviewed, being tested, being deployed. You show things along the timeline of how they're getting done, and you assign them to people and things like that. And then to-do lists, hopefully everyone knows what a to-do list is, but there are plenty of tools like Basecamp and Asana that also kind of you can use to create more complex to-do lists that have, categorization and assignments and things like that. So the last point is talking about iteration. Creating the building blocks and the foundational pieces of a product first. We talked about MVPs, right? Minimal viable products. Creating the foundational things that you need to deliver the core value before adding all the bells and whistles, and delivering that and testing that idea so that it's strong and stronger before you start adding additional features and things like that to continue adding its value. So once you've launched, you can monitor your metrics and performance, figure out what things you can learn from, and make changes. One thing that I've liked to do with my teams is do routine retrospective meetings. So a retrospective meeting, you might even, some people call these postmortems, which I think is just a sad term. So I like to call them retrospectives. But it's basically where you bring the team together to evaluate what's working, what's not working, and how you should change or pivot, right? So I would do these typically at every 2-week planning meeting with my team, but you could do them on a monthly basis. Some people just like to do them at the end of a major project, but I find that that's often too late because you want to be able to course correct if something is going wrong in the middle of a project. So you bring your team together, you give everyone 5 or 10 minutes for quiet introspection, and you say, write down all of the things that you think, are working about the way that we're doing this project or working together, things that have been challenging or that are not working for you, and areas in which you think the team should change. And everyone kind of writes these things down on Post-its, or there are digital tools for doing retrospectives if you work remotely. And then you put them on the board and you discuss them. Someone will read out all of the Post-its and you will have a discussion about things that either are working, where you can celebrate each other, you can have gratitude, things like that, or you can talk about what's not working and kind of understand the problem and come up sometimes with even more ways in which you want to change. So you can add things to the board even throughout this discussion on what are we going to do to fix this thing that's not working, or what are we going to do to build on this thing that is working. And so you can use this as a way to kind of build that rapport among your team, build trust, and create better communication. So that is it for my main presentation. I would love to hear from all of you and open it up to everyone else, to the floor. Great. So if you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand and unmute or drop them in the chat. And a great tip from Naima, she uses Trello for her retrospectives. She shares the board ahead of the meeting, and then people have time to think about it before they even go into the meeting. I think that's a great idea. And Trello, if you're not familiar with it, is a project management tool that uses a Kanban format, which I talked about. Yeah. Can you talk about teaching product to students in courses? Yes, this is very relevant because the News Product Alliance had an event yesterday where we had like 5 or 6 professors come and talk about how they teach product to students at the undergraduate and the graduate level. So if you want to join this discussion, they are on the MPA Slack community, and you can join them. They shared their syllabuses and stuff, or syllabi, I should say. But yeah, I think a lot of times where people start in teaching product to students is teaching them digital skills, things like UX design, the basics of coding websites, like, HTML, things like that. And then they work on kind of the idea of actually building a product once you have those skills, thinking about, conducting audience research. One person gave the example of they have the students brainstorm, problems that college students have, because they're going to know those very well within their groups. And then coming up with a problem statement that they tend to solve, prototyping their idea, testing it, and then building a mock-up or a mini version of it that's actually a digital product, if they have the skills to do that, if they have the skills and the training to build like a website or do a podcast and things like that. So you walk them through the whole product development cycle, essentially. I think that that's great. I think the other thing that they have found is really helpful is bringing in guest lecturers to talk about what it's like to actually build product in the newsroom right now, right? Because a lot of the soft skills that we've talked about today, like managing stakeholders, facing resistance to change, talking about prioritization, those things can be hard to replicate in like a student university setting. So having guest speakers come in and talk about what it's really like to build products in the newsroom can be helpful. Cool. Any other questions or comments? If you guys have thoughts on the presentations or something that resonated with you, feel free to jump in.
Hi. So one of the things that I realized is when we're using sort of these different tools to manage stuff. So there's the Gantt charts and Trello. Sometimes there's sort of like a loss of communication. Just stuff is happening in a specific place, and other people are maybe on Slack, because we use Slack for communication. So I have specific team channels for, like, the data team, and then there's the data team, design team, and the journalists. But then we actually use Trello notifications on Slack, so that when something has changed or when you've been tagged on something in Trello, and you don't necessarily have to go into the email or into Trello if that's not where you are at that specific moment. And recently I found out that you can actually turn a Slack message into a Trello card. If someone has asked you to do something, you can actually put it into a Trello card so that it's there. Yeah. So figuring out how to make the communication easier, even with all the tech, because sometimes stuff gets lost in people working on different platforms at different times.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Naima. On my teams, what we often found is, the tech and the engineering and the product people are more active on Slack sometimes during the day than the editorial and reporting team, because they're out reporting, they're out doing their work. And so creating automations, as you've talked about, can be really helpful. I know that the Texas Tribune, after I left, but I've heard from talking to people there that they set up a ton of automations for their Slack, so that each time a story goes through a step in the editing process, from being, a breaking news story is put in the CMS, to it's ready to socialize, to, all these different steps. They send out notifications to specific channels so the people who need to do that work can see it and are aware of it. So figuring out how to create transparent communication by using automations and using the tools at your disposal is great. I think it's very, very important. So Sarah says, I'm a project lead for a civic tech org, not a newsroom. We're a consortium of 6 orgs across South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, 40-person team. We operate on sprints every 2 weeks with the whole team. We're trying to push back on meeting loads, but I'm wanting to implement retros. Any advice? Great question. So how do you kind of add these conversations when you already have so many meetings on your plate? I know what meeting overload is like, and it can be very hard. So I would think about, one, what are the meetings that do not need to be really meetings? Like, for each meeting that you have on your team calendar, like, can this work be accomplished asynchronously? So, like, for example, some people do daily stand-ups, and they decide that actually we could do our daily stand-up virtually and have everyone put this in Slack versus having a conversation and just, talk about things, if and when the need arises. You might also think about kind of the cadence of certain meetings. Does it need to happen every 2 weeks? Could it happen every 3 weeks? Things like that. And then you also might think about, are there sometimes like one-on-one meetings that should be 3-person meetings you can kind of condense like that. I also would say retros are something that you could add on to the sprint process. So you might think about, like, is there a place in the sprint meeting itself where you could have that retrospective conversation, maybe cut down on other parts of that meeting? Say, if you're doing a lot of like sorting through your tasks, like, can some of that work be done ahead of time by people before they get to the meeting so that you have more time in the meeting itself for the conversation? My other just like general meeting advice is always have an agenda for every meeting, no matter what it is, whether it's a one-on-one meeting with someone or a team meeting. Always have an agenda, and that will help you kind of contain the scope of the meeting and make sure that you're not just, wasting a bunch of time going on tangents. Great. So the way you broke this down and simplified it, as well as, oh, thank you. Time well spent. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. Do you know if there are any product communities in Africa? It's always difficult to learn and implement things that work well in the US that may not work in the African context. This is a great question. I think I don't actually know of any specific to Africa. So I'd love for people to jump into the chat if they have an answer to this question. The News Product Alliance is global, and we do have current members from Africa. I would say not as many as I would like. So I'd love for everyone who this presentation resonated with to join us, because I think your perspectives would add a lot of value to our community. And I think that is one of the things that we hear across, all the different regions, is that some of the things that, work in the US do not work in certain contexts because the way people communicate or certain cultural things are just simply different. And so I think bringing people together to have those conversations is really helpful, because you can find the things that do seem to be universal, and you can also talk to other people who find that other ways of doing things work better, right? Yeah, some other organizations that you might look at are INMA. I know they have a product initiative. And yeah, I don't really know though. But yeah, feel free to join in if anyone has suggestions on this. Great. Oh, INMA is INMA. I don't actually know what it stands for, but I know that they just launched like a new product group that some news organizations are part of. Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, looks we have one in the Q&A. When starting out with access to a very small audience, what is the best way to do research? I'm struggling to get people to submit their feedback via surveys. Do you have tips or other best practice ideas to do research? This is a great question. I think a lot of times people struggle to get enough information from surveys for it to actually be useful. So I think in this case, if you're really just starting out and you're small, what you might try is some sort of listening event. So in this case, like I know when I worked at Chalkbeat, they had what they called a listening tour. And they would contact community leaders because they did education. It might be principals or school administrators or people who are involved in parent-teacher associations. They would contact these people who had a lot of access to the community, and they would organize an event and bring in 10, 15, 20 people and do one of these like ideation sessions with the audience itself, pose a question to the audience like, how might we help you get access to local education news, which was Chalkbeat's question, but like you could do it for whatever your kind of editorial mission is, and kind of get people to offer their ideas and just listen to what they say their problems are and why it's difficult for them to get the news that you want to offer, things like that. You can also just, use community leaders to try and identify people and do one-on-one interview sessions and kind of start to find people that, you can just talk to and get more qualitative information as you start out. So you can figure out, is this something that's actually going to deliver value to them? Great. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we can end a little bit early. Great. All right, well, I'm going to stop my share. So in closing, I would like everyone to know that you can join us at 4 p.m. Central Africa time for a fireside chat with Sally Thiam of None on Record on podcasting in Africa and more. And remember to join us for the virtual exhibit this evening, starting at 5 p.m. Central African time. And that's it. That's all we have for this session. But thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciated all of the insightful insights that you guys contributed and having this conversation with all of you. Like I said, feel free to join the News Product Alliance at newsproduct.org, and we'll see you at the next session. So thank you, everyone.
Singamakawe.
Sisi wenyewe ni mashujaa.
Nous sommes nos propres héros.
Tirimagamba Pachedu.
We are our own heroes.
Power to the innovators, the DIYers across the continent.
Power to you who push the doors wide open.
Power to you who've planted good seed on fertile African ground. We celebrate you. Thank you for joining us. Visit our websites and social media platforms to continue the conversation.